Hi. Today we will take a closer look at verbal communication. Verbal communication includes both our words and verbal fillers. Verbal fillers are things like mm, ah, oh, huh. Language always includes a nonverbal component as well. Things like hand gestures, posture, body movement. But what is sometimes confusing to students is that components such as tone of voice, how quickly or slowly someone speaks, etc., are actually considered by some to be nonverbal components. We will actually cover these under the nonverbal section under paralanguage. Although paralanguage may be considered nonverbal, they do affect the verbal message, how it is received and interpreted. For example, think about the difference between nice to meet you versus nice to meet you. The paralanguage components, tone, speech rate, and other nonverbal components such as facial expression, hand gesture, posture, provide important additional information to the verbal message, nice to meet you. But first, let's begin with some basics. Language is the system of symbols or words with grammatical rules we use to communicate and think. So, language is symbolic in that words are symbols that represent people, ideas, or things, and these are agreed upon by a language using community. For example, what comes to mind when I say dog? You may picture your own dog, or a dog you've seen on TV, or a dog your roommate has. The word dog, for most of us who speak English, evokes a similar response because it's a symbol that we have agreed upon to represent a four-legged, furry companion. In Spanish, the agreed upon symbol or word for dog is perro. One quarter, when I asked this in class in a traditional lecture, a young woman raised her hand and said, "My ex-boyfriend is a dog." Now that threw me for a loop because, again, I was focused on the furry, four-legged dog. And I know many people consider their pets family. We do. But I wasn't making the connection that she was making. Now hold on to that. We'll come back to that example in a moment. But in all seriousness, that we know of, only humans use symbols. Now, symbols alone are not enough to correctly use a language. There are issues of grammar, which we won't cover here, but you're familiar with, I hope. But also semantics and pragmatics. Semantics involves the meaning of words and their meaning within sentences. Pragmatics takes these words and meanings, but also considers the context in which the words are used. For most of us, we process semantics and pragmatics instinctively, and we notice when the meaning of something isn't clear. Usually, lack of clarity comes from poor grammar, ambiguous word choices, and unclear context. Newspaper headlines are notorious for this. For example, here's a couple. Kids make nutritious snacks for alligators. Or how about homicide victims rarely talk to police? Another factor to consider is that words often have multiple meanings. So returning to my student who calls her ex a dog, she is technically using one of the denotative meanings of the word dog. The denotative meaning of a word is its commonly accepted definition. In fact, if you look up dog in the dictionary, the first definition describes a domesticated carnivorous mammal, and the second definition is for a person regarded as unpleasant, contemptible, or wicked. The connotative meaning of a word is the emotional or attitudinal response people have to a word. For example, let's think of the word school. What comes to mind for you? how do you feel about it? Now, I have always loved school, even through the thick of it. So it would make sense that I would keep going to school to earn my doctorate, yeah? I also have fond memories of all phases of my time in school, even elementary, the ugliness of junior high, high school. But not everyone feels the same about school as I do. In fact, I have a friend who hated school because she was bullied all throughout elementary school, all the way through high school. So we just don't talk about that time frame in our lives when we get together. Now, this is a really bland example of a word and how it can conjure images that are different for different people, and how it might have a different impact just from the sheer use of it. There are words that are much more powerful in their use. So we know it's important to choose words carefully, and we should do so by first considering both the denotative and connotative types of meaning to ensure the response we're going for is the correct response. Subtle differences in word meaning can totally change someone's entire interpretation of what's been said. In addition to word interpretation, we should also consider that language works on various levels of abstraction that range from the vague to specific. Linguist S.I. Hayakawa created an abstraction ladder, and this shows how a sequence of words can represent high-level abstractions, which are general and vague, to more specific, lower-level abstractions that, as shown by examples here. While lower abstractions work to ensure clarity, high-level abstractions often allow for the following. Evasion, which allows a speaker to avoid providing specific details. For example, when I was in high school, I would tell my parents that I would be out with friends. Rather than the more specific, I'm going to a raging party with my friends 2 towns over. Equivocation uses words that have unclear or misleading definitions and helps a speaker to maybe avoid uncomfortable situations. For example, a friend of mine recently got a shag haircut, and she asked me what I thought about it. I responded, "It's very fashionable." I didn't think it suited her, but I didn't want to hurt her feelings. And really, what does it matter if I didn't think it suited her? She liked it. And I also didn't want to lie to her. So instead, I equivocated. In my defense, I did see the haircut in a recent Vogue fashion layout, so she's totally in the know. Then there are euphemisms. Euphemisms are inoffensive words or phrases that substitute for potentially upsetting terms. For example, you might say that a loved one has passed away rather than saying they have died. Now, I'd like to point out that abstract language should not prevent communicators from attempting to address difficult issues. Abstract language may just force us to seek much needed clarification. So while some of my examples are a bit cheeky, I hope you can see how strategic ambiguity may help promote harmony, soften difficult messages, and maybe make a point indirectly. Abstract language can also offer information about affiliations and memberships. So think of things like slang. This is non-standard language used by a particular group of people during a specific time and place. It is a high-level abstraction in that it can identify people by group. So when I was in college many moons ago, I remember I could always tell when someone was from Northern California because they would constantly say, "hella," instead of "very," or that someone was from the specific San Rafael area because they would say, "right on," instead of "cool," or "awesome," or "okay." Recently, I heard my son use the term GTA. Specifically, I heard him say, "my mom won't let me get GTA." Well, that piqued my interest. I found out that indeed I would not allow him to get GTA because GTA stands for Grand Theft Auto, a mature video game that is not appropriate for an 11-year-old. Yet, GTA was completely understood by his buddies. Jargon, on the other hand, is technical language. This is specific to professions or interest groups. And they can be abstract to those outside of the group, but clear to group members. So while in college, I watched enough Law and Order to get some of the police and detective jargon. For those of you who don't know, Law and Order is a police and court show. So for example, I know that when a detective yells, "Call a bus," that they mean an ambulance. Or when they say, "APB," it means all points bulletin or alert to a suspect or person of interest. Anyway, you get the point. Words, as you have probably experienced, can lead to confusion, misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and anger when there's a lack of clarity or when things are blurted out before considering what is being said. But there's some language we engage in that is often inflammatory. These include things like hate speech, labeling, and bias language. Hate speech uses offensive words to deride a person or group. This language offends, it threatens, insults, and it does so based on a person's race, religion, gender, or other identifiable characteristics. Labeling is how we use them for ourselves and for others. It constricts our communication. So let me give you an example to explain. Most recently, I was having a conversation about current lobbying efforts in Washington, and someone turned to me and said, "What do you know? You're an academic." Well, yes, but I also spent over 10 years working in the field and continue to consult in the field, so I know my way around lobbying. But the intent there by that comment was to label me and in an effort limit me. Bias language is a bit subtler. For example, a recent study had us consider how we describe those individuals who engage in casual sex. The research found that when referring to a male, he was most often described as a player. But when referring to a female who was engaged in the same type of behavior, she was more likely to be described as easy. What's the problem with that, you might ask? Well, this bias in the language perpetuates perceptions of women as less competent than men in similar situations. But biased language can also affect how others perceive you. Earlier, we touched upon language and context when considering denotative language. But there's a much larger area of language and context that considers how language works within our relationships, situations, cultures, and in mediated settings. We briefly touched on this when we talked about the transactional model of communication. Context is particularly important to language in that language reflects, builds on, and determines context. So situational context notes that different situations call for different speech repertoires. Code switching occurs when communicators change from one repertoire or code to another as the situation warrants. For example, you would likely use one repertoire or code in a job interview and another when you're at home with your roommates. Research finds that people do adapt their language differently in same-sex versus mixed-sex situations, and that gendered contexts often will develop a job culture and language that follows suit. So a female police officer, a traditionally masculine job, may adopt more masculine language while she is on the job. Language also reflects and creates the relational context. Labels like mom, dad, for example, seem pretty basic. But I knew of a family growing up whose children called their parents by their first names. This gave me insight into their parent-child relational context. Labels also confer status and create understandings between and among individuals. For example, I might introduce my boss not by first name only, but by prefacing the introduction by saying, "This is my chair." think of how we use other labels, labels of girlfriend, partner, and friend. All may create different understandings about the relational context. And we concern ourselves with these labels. I remember having many a conversation with friends about whether or not they could call their significant other boyfriend or girlfriend, or whether they should still remain to call them friend. Why? Because the label implies another level of intimacy in the relationship beyond friend. When you tell someone they are friend material, you're essentially letting them know that there is a lack of romantic interest on your part. It is also important to recognize the communication differences that exist between speakers from different languages or cultures. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also known as linguistic relativity theory, claims that the words a culture uses or does not use influences thinking. In other words, language influences or determines how we see the world. Speakers of different languages have different views of the world. For example, English is a gender-neutral language. A speaker may simply say, the plant. Whereas in Spanish, the speaker would mark the word as masculine or feminine, la planta. But also think about family descriptions. In English, we simply say brother-in-law to describe a man married to your sibling, or a man married to your partner's sibling. Not in Spanish. If a man is married to your sibling, you would call them cuñado. If a man is married to your partner's sibling, you would call them concuño. This is because where you are in the family is important. Or, back to linguistic relativity, the words a culture uses or does not influences thinking. There are many examples of this that go beyond the differences between English and Spanish, but I'm just familiar with both languages, so it's easy to pull examples from these. There are tribes, for example, that have many meanings for certain plants or trees, and so they have different names for plants or trees, where I would simply call it a plant or a tree. And because the language is probably not English, these words may not necessarily translate in English, and therefore we also lose the meanings. You can take that example a little further and think about how someone who is really into gardening might have different words for plants and trees, and even further when you consider, say, a botanist and the number of words they would have for those same plants and trees. Anyway, we're going to switch gears a bit here to discuss gender and language. Cultural factors deeply affect our thinking and perception of gender, gender roles, and gendered language. Research finds that women primarily see conversations as negotiations for closeness and connection, while men see talk as more of a struggle for control, independence, and hierarchy. When negotiating, which we'll cover later on, when status is equal, men interrupt women more than women interrupt men. Research also finds that women use more intensifiers, qualifiers, hedges, and disclaimers than men. What are these? Intensifiers heighten or intensify topics. For example, I'm so excited versus I'm excited. So the adding of so is an intensifier. Qualifiers are things like kind of, maybe, possibly. So we add this to the language. I kind of think we should maybe change gears. Hedges are when we add things like I think or I feel. I feel that perhaps we should consider, insert whatever there. And disclaimers are things like it's probably nothing but, or this may not be important but. Now, a disclaimer discounts you before you even make the statement. Women also tend to use more tag questions at the end of sentences in order to establish a connection. This sounds like, he was really rude, wasn't he? But use of this language sounds hesitant and is often perceived as less powerful when used in professional settings. Unfortunately, this is language that I still encounter across meetings and boardrooms every day. The use of this language by women may also continue based on what is acceptable language for women to use, even in boardrooms. We will discuss this more when we discuss negotiation. Well, that's it for today. Thank you. Until next time.